Episode 20, Wheat and Barley. Missing Real Bread and Beer. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the different attempts at growing wheat and barley in the 17th century British colonies and how success ultimately depended on those foreign Protestant weirdos I mentioned way back in Episode 5. And I'll talk about how much English and Northern European bread and beer culture depended on those two grains. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. A lot of failed wheat and barley crops were sown in the 17th century British colonies. It may seem odd that in spite of the fact that corn, rye, and oats were far better suited to and more successful in the New England climate, farmers kept stubbornly trying. Why were these grains so important to them? Why couldn't they just branch out? To understand this, we need to look back to what carbohydrate culture was in the England they left, and also in Northern Europe, that was home to most of the next waves of immigrants to Pennsylvania at the end of the century. To begin, we need to recall that the average small farmer and farm wife at this time were both burning calories like Michael Phelps training for the Olympics. The closest thing these people had in terms of everyday mechanical help was the lever and the wheel. And many of them didn't even have wheels. It was literally a chop wood, haul water society where every task was done by hand. Even the inside, feminine assigned work included the regular heavy lifting of iron kettles full of gallons of liquid. And the work both inside the house and out went from sunrise, or slightly before, all the way to dark. The calories necessary to pull off this constant stream of labor were far higher than what the modern sedentary American takes in. So ready access to grain calories, especially in English society where the laboring classes had limited access to meat, were very important. The two main sources of grain calories for the English common people were bread and beer. And each of these items had their own internal status markers. Bread in 16th and 17th century Britain, and I'm purposely including Ireland, Scotland, and Wales here, was a very class-conscious item. The amount of oats or barley or rye or acorn flour or peas or whatever it contained in proportion to wheat let everyone know where someone was on the social ladder. The more wheat it contained, the better they were doing. The coarseness of the grind of the flour also spoke to social status. If a peasant only had whole grains, bread wasn't possible. Instead, they were stuck with soaking grains in a liquid, either water, vegetable or meat broth, or a dairy liquid like clabber, buttermilk, or whey, and slowly cooking a pottage. If you have a grocery store that sells stuff from bins, you can see these whole grains under names like pearl barley, wheat berries, emmer, and whole or pinhead oats. Farm families who had access to a mortar and pestle could get to a cracked or very coarsely pounded grain. This allowed for savory boiled puddings. For the American listener, you need to think like haggis or a grainy sausage that contains something like rice or oats. I'm not talking about a sweet pudding. And then there were flatbreads like bannock or ash cake. For scale, the modern equivalents are things like cracked or bulgur wheat or steel-cut oats. Cracked grains just don't get much shelf space in the modern pantry. Households with access to a quern, which is a stone hand mill, could produce a coarse grind like grits, sort of coarse cornmeal or cream of wheat or cream of rice, something the size of maybe quinoa or regular couscous. I realize those last two are not ground grains, but like cracked grains, there aren't many examples in the modern pantry that give a reasonable size comparison. And even this type of grinding was a huge effort. The quernstone, which was turned atop a bottom saddle stone, was made of a hard, heavy rock like granite and usually weighed in at around 25 pounds or about 10 kilos. If 2 women were working a quern, around 5 pounds or 2 kilos of grain could be ground in an hour. Just think about the effort needed to keep turning a 25-pound grindstone using a rotating stick handle for a solid hour, or even 2. To get the true powdery flour we think of when we think of baking, larger water mills and their millstones of several hundred pounds were needed. Those started to come into widespread use in the 13th and 14th centuries, and was the same technology that made the faster metal smelting possible back in episode 1. By the 17th century, windmills were also commonly in use. Since both water and windmills were typically owned by the land-owning nobility who charged fees or rents for grinding grain or flour, the installation of such structures were often followed by laws outlawing hand querns at home. Directives were published to hunt out and even break these stones. Under such laws, grinding one's own grain was considered a form of poaching, for it deprived the landowner of what he was owed. So let's say an Englishman got to full wheat bread. Then the question was, how white was that wheat? And in this case, white specifically meant that the bran, a protective layer around the seed, and the germ, the part of the seed where the sprout was, had been bolted or sifted out. And because all the sifting was done with straight muscle power, that meant someone had sifted that flour multiple times to get out the bran, the germ, and the bigger chunky pieces. All that effort and all those unacceptable parts are what made fine white wheat flour so expensive. Oh, but don't worry, those unacceptable parts were not trash. They all had future uses. The thing that made wheat the most desirable bread flour was the gluten. Gluten is a particular protein found in large amounts in wheat and in smaller amounts in other cereal grains like barley, rye, and buckwheat. It allows the starch in the cereals, when wet, to stick together and stretch into long, sticky strands. That's what traps the carbon dioxide bubbles burped out by the yeast as they munch away at the sugars in the flour. These trapped bubbles are what give bread its spring and lightness. Other grains, because they have little or no gluten, can trap few or no bubbles. The resulting breads are dense, chewy, and sometimes even hard or gluey. Throughout England and Northern Europe, people made do with the breads they could make with the grains and fillers they could get. Daily bread of whatever sort was a huge part of the calorie intake of the average laborer. It could be baked in large batches once a week. Once prepared, bread was one of the few highly available, ready-to-eat, somewhat shelf-stable, and highly portable foods of the time. So the desire to grow wheat to make the most desired bread was very strong. The other grain that was hard to grow in New England, but highly desirable, was barley. This time not for bread, at least not directly, but instead for beer. As with bread, beer could be and was made out of a variety of things. And as with bread, there is status associated with the composition of beer. Barley beer was best, but as barley became scarce, other grains like corn or other starch and sugar sources like pumpkin and persimmons provided the yeast with food. In fact, any vegetable matter, whether grain, fruit, or vegetable, can be made into beer because it has starches that can be broken down into sugars, which can then be munched on by yeast. The yeast once again burp out carbon dioxide, which is what carbonates the beer. The part of the sugars that are not turned into CO2 are turned into ethyl alcohol, or ethanol. That's the alcohol in beer. Incidentally, yeast are also making ethanol when working on bread, but that alcohol is mostly evaporating as it's made, and what is left is evaporated and destroyed by the high-temperature cooking process required for bread making. But in beer, the ethanol is dissolved in the water where the beer process is occurring, so it just stays there. This makes beer a second important source of grain calories. Because of the alcohol, the carbohydrates in beer are guarded from spoilage by things like bacteria and molds. And because the beer is stored in watertight barrels, the calories are also guarded from larger critters like insects, mice, and rats. And like bread, once prepared, it stores well and is easily consumed, if a bit less portable. And brewing beer kept a steady supply of yeast on hand for, you guessed it, baking bread. Wheat and barley require some things New England weather would not deliver. In order to germinate, the strains of wheat and barley in use at the time needed the soil they were planted in to warm above a certain temperature. New England tended to have later spring frosts than Old England, which meant New England's fields couldn't be planted until later in the year. The later planting then meant the grains, which required a full 6 months to mature, were more likely to be growing into the damp fall. This made them subject to rust, a fungal infection, or mildew, or incomplete ripening of the grain because there just wasn't enough sun and heat at the end of the growing cycle. All of which meant, despite all the work, in New England, those colonists made do with corn bread and pumpkin beer, but they also kept trying. Wheat bread and barley-based beer were not just the preferred grain foods of Britain, they were also the favorites in Northern Europe, especially in the Low Countries where Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg are now, and in the German, Bavarian, and Bohemian areas that fed much of the late 17th and 18th century migration into Pennsylvania and the other middle colonies. Because of the more fractured political nature of these areas, there tended to be far more landowners holding smaller plots of land, rather than the more consolidated structure of land ownership in England. So more of these immigrants tended to be skilled farmers than their earlier English counterparts had been. Many of the English colonists had been peasants kicked off their land due to the rising Enclosure Acts, or they were day laborers, ex-soldiers, and town dwellers. These were all seeking either religious freedom or escaping from the certain grinding poverty the changing rural landscape offered them. All these groups tended to have limited experience in the planning it took to run a farm dawn to dusk, year in and year out. They were also more likely to arrive as single men. The single guy problem is also why very little wheat and barley was grown in Virginia and the Carolinas. These guys were on their own or in small groups, and most importantly, were looking to make a fast buck. They weren't looking to set up a self-supporting farm economy that would last for generations. Yes, the ground and the climate were capable of growing wheat and barley, and some was grown, particularly by the larger landowners for their own use. But for most people, the cash returns of grain were nothing compared to the potential profits to be made on tobacco. So land on the Chesapeake was turned to tobacco. The colonists from the Low Countries and the German, Bavarian, and Bohemian principalities, on the other hand, were often more successful farmers on small to medium-sized farms who were leaving due to a combination of reasons. Religious freedom was often in the mix, but reasons included the constant disruption of farming and trade because of frequent wars between the principalities, rising taxes and tolls, and increasingly repressive actions as different states sought to crush even the lightest of democratic reforms. Also, unlike the English, many of these colonists were able to come not as indentured servants alone, but rather as entire extended families, often with some servants in tow. They had not just the knowledge, but the family labor needed to set up and keep successful farms. And by choosing Pennsylvania and the middle colonies, they were also planting their grain fields on land with climates suited to wheat and barley production. So how did a 17th century farmer grow grain? The visual of a farmer following oxen pulling a plow definitely applies here. There may have been a few horses, but the European large draft horses had not yet made it over. Horses don't digest as efficiently as cows, so they need much more fodder, especially in the winter. And in the tight food economy of the time, an animal that wasn't generally regarded as supper at the end of its work life was not something people would have on their farms. So cows were pulling plows. In the 17th century, plowshares, that part that cuts the earth, were either wood or mostly wood with an iron cap. They only cut a shallow furrow in the land and weren't as efficient as what would happen in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The farmer would usually plow a cross-hatch pattern in the field, breaking up the dirt and turning over the weeds. After the crisscross plowing, seeds would be broadcast by hand over the plowed fields. It took a skilled hand to toss the seeds in an even spread and not end up with grain plants alternately too crowded and too spread out. In the 17th century, the system of planting rows of wheat was beginning to be instituted in some places, seeding behind the plow in tiny hillocks, but that method was more time and labor intensive and could lead to seeds getting eaten or rotting due to soil parasites when planted too deep. And broadcast seeding, along with being faster, tended to choke out weeds with its initial dense growth of seedlings. So it was the method of choice. The greater availability of metal in the next century would change the equation. It was also common to mix grains in a given field. Some combination of wheat, barley, and rye was the most typical combination in places where less of the grain was ground into flour. A grain mixture as the base of pottage or beer was fairly common at this point, and incidentally was part of what was behind some of the beer purity laws in the German and Bavarian states. In the early colonies, this sort of multi-seed mixture would be used as farmers were trying to hedge their bets when planting cereal grains in unfamiliar soil with an unfamiliar climate. This way, any given field of grain was less likely to suffer complete failure. All the same, as the wheat and barley crops failed, not only was there no wheat for the best bread and no barley for the best beer, worst of all, there was less and less seed for planting. Running out of seeds is one of the main forces that ultimately limited and then generally ended wheat and barley cultivation in New England. Around a bushel per acre of seed was needed to plant each acre. If the ground was only producing 8 bushels of wheat, but possibly 6 of the bushels were lost to rust or didn't mature or simply rotted in the field due to uncooperative rains, how does a farmer simply save the seeds and leave almost nothing for eating or selling? So much effort for no return. And with no seed store to go to, there was no way to replant fields if the seed grain was simply eaten. New England farmers hung on for a while, continuing to try. But at the end of the century, as seed stocks were exhausted and then wheat and barley were to be had in Pennsylvania, they turned more and more to fish and dairy to trade for wheat and barley. In Pennsylvania, not only did the colonists arrive with the know-how and the correct workforce for farming wheat, they had the right weather. Warm enough springs to plant in time, the tendency for spring rains to come with adequate frequency, and summer heat that would come along and stay long enough to ripen and dry the grain. But possibly most importantly, they had incredible dirt. The land in what was assigned to William Penn for his Quaker utopia had never been broken in long furrows by plows. It had been only lightly cultivated by Native Americans using methods that did not break up the root cover. And they either moved on before a field's nutrients were depleted or practiced a variety of composting and soil-enriching methods. Different societies practiced a variety of techniques over the millennia. When Pennsylvania's farmers arrived, They were amazed to find that a single acre of land would produce as much as 40 and possibly 50 bushels per acre from a single bushel of seed. Plowing the roots and straw in from last year's harvest, along with a desultory application of some animal manure collected and composted over the year, seemed to be adequate fertilizer. This meant in those first decades, the farmers in the middle colonies had a low upkeep cereal crop that would keep them fed as well as provide a sizable surplus. But one of the strangest things is that despite the startling wheat harvests, most of the wheat grown in Pennsylvania and the middle colonies in the 17th century did not become local bread. As I mentioned earlier, baking bread requires ground flour, which in turn requires a long list of steps, all requiring significant time and muscle power. After harvesting, which in the 17th century was done by hand using a scythe, it's that thing that the cloaked figure of death walks around with, or a sickle, which is a curved blade on a shorter handle. Then the cut wheat had to be gathered, tied with straw into sheaves, and stacked in the fields to finish drying. These cured sheaves would then need to be threshed. This was how the seeds were broken out of the seed heads at the top of the plant. Once the straw was cleared away, the threshed wheat had to be winnowed, the heavier seeds separated from the lighter casings, or chaff. Then the grain had to be ground and bolted or sifted. And as I explained above, to get flour, a large-scale wind or water-powered mill was almost always required. And few of those were around in the 17th century in the areas where most of the wheat was being grown. As a result, much of the wheat was exported as whole grains, and except in the few places where large mills had been installed in the 17th century, most of the locally consumed wheat was eaten as whole grains in pottages or cracked grains in things like frumenty, flummery, and puddings. Also exacerbating the bread issue was the lack of ovens. These were engineering projects that often came later on the list of what a house needed, with chimney, roof, and walls coming first. Because Pennsylvania and the middle colonies only really got going in the 1860s and later, in those first 2 decades of Pennsylvania and middle colony settlement, there simply weren't many ovens around as there were in the older, more well-established New England colonies. But wheat was a very valuable export. So it often made more sense to mostly sell the wheat and eat the corn, which was less work to get to an edible state. And with their extended families for labor and this comfortable food security margin, Pennsylvania and middle colony farm families had time to cultivate various vegetables, hunt for game, and do the time-consuming jobs of building homes, storage cellars, fences, and preserving foods. And the cash from selling their wheat surplus brought in a variety of other foodstuffs: fish, cheese, and tobacco from the colonies to the north and south, and sugar and molasses from Barbados. Incidentally, wheat being traded directly to the other colonies was an important building block of what was to become a vibrant intra-colonial trade that would lead to the furious writing of the Navigation Acts in the 18th century, which in turn would encourage even greater piracy than in the 17th century. England and parts of Western Europe were happy to pay for the wheat as well. They were suffering from increased food supply instability due to the toll wars were taking on food growing and transport. The rise of cannon on land and on the sea, along with improved firearms, meant there was a constant and growing stream of governmental requisitions of men, food, and draft animals to feed and supply labor to merchant marine activities, naval warfare, and local land squabbles. While England was growing its naval power, engaging in wars, civil and otherwise, they were also making the grain supply problem even worse, because large landowners were also looking for lower labor methods to make money. Despite ever-dwindling supplies of homegrown wheat, Perverse incentives caused these lords to continue to push farming peasants off land to make way for sheep for the wool trade and cows to supply salt beef to the growing naval and merchant fleets. The British East India Company had started in 1600 and continued to be a source of glamorous stories of adventure and fortunes made. Over time, more and more ships had to be supplied as they left to pick up cargoes of spices, cotton, and tea. And as the bureaucracy expanded and larger food imports were demanded there, as more officials were missing food from home. Being involved in this East India trade seemed more glamorous than simply supplying for the daily bread at home. Pennsylvania barley, on the other hand, tended to stay local, or at least go not much further afield than to New England. While the barley had to be harvested and threshed with approximately the same effort, from there it was less work to brew beer than it was to mill flour and then bake bread. And the equipment threshold was much lower. All that was needed was some tubs, a dark, fairly temperature-stable location, and a good water source. Whole grains were forced to sprout, then they were dried and roughly cracked and soaked to make the mash, rather than being extensively milled as for flour. And as a bonus, used mash left from brewing was used to feed cows, chickens, and pigs, making yet more calories available to the farmer in the tight colonial food economy. As a result, by the end of the 17th century, the enormous variety of make-do beers brewed at the start of the century would begin to give way to the higher-end barley beers. While the early colonists in pre-America had very little wheat and barley at the start of the 17th century, by the time Pennsylvania and the middle colonies had been settled at the end of the century, the wheat and barley supplies started to become sound. They were still out of reach of most of the small farmers in New England and to the indentured servants who had fulfilled their time and gotten their payout in plots of land. Wheat bread and barley beer were almost entirely unavailable to the population of enslaved West Africans who were starting to make up more of the population on American shores. Some slave owners went to the trouble to justify their policy of wheat bread inside, corn pone outside by claiming that even when they provided the people they owned with wheat bread, it was refused. They repeatedly claimed that they had been told cornbread was actually preferred. This contention is consistently contradicted by both contemporary records showing enslaved people who were allowed to make money selling produce, often purchasing wheat bread, and much later oral histories that talked about wheat bread and cakes being provided as treats at Christmas. Alternatively, slave owners would use the argument that wheat breads made enslaved workers weaker or more sluggish or less productive, or that because they were doing rougher work, they required rougher, hardier food to stay up to the job, to justify only feeding them the cheapest foodstuffs. In the 17th century, most of the indigenous people of the Americas also had limited contact with wheat and barley. Their farming and cultivation methods were unsuited to it, but they occasionally encountered wheaten baked goods and enjoyed them quite a bit, to the point where laws were written forbidding bakers to trade bread for furs and hides or wampum, that is, the drilled, polished shell cylinders used as money. Trading bread for furs angered fur agents because they had to pay higher prices to the bakers, and outraged some city fathers who felt that civilized food was being, quote, wasted upon savage appetites, unquote. By the end of the 17th century, the British colonies were well on their way to establishing the American success with wheat and barley. So next time, I'll look into one of the products in much more detail. Beer. It's not just for pilgrim breakfast anymore. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. And along with my Twitter, I have just started up an Instagram feed at @THOAFood, so now you can find me there. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference. Just as voting in a special and midterm election, saying something informative in the comments has a bigger impact than you think. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at @THOAFood and in the show description.